Hi there, everybody, and thank you for coming along for tonight's talk. I think you're going to find it interesting, perhaps challenging. I'm delighted to see there's some men in the room, so we're not all female, talking about the female gaze, and thank you all for being here. Tomorrow is the celebration of World Press Freedom Day, and we thought this would be a perfect opportunity tonight to have a conversation about the female gaze and what it has meant to women over the years as practicing photographers, curators, directors, and artists participating. I'm delighted to be here myself. I just came back from Rwanda, where I was on assignment working in an unusual environment, doing a story about post-conflict and also about the empowerment of women. And it was great fun, and I'm happy to be home as well, of course. Let me introduce the panel and then tell you a little bit about what the show is going to contain tonight. So I'll start first with Shoair, because she's going to be our first speaker. She's the director of the Photographers Gallery, and she will describe exactly what the gallery is all about, rather than leaving to a layman like me to do that. Fiona Shields is the head of photography at the Guardian newspaper, and a friend as well. And I always say to her that I love about the Guardian, first thing in the morning, rather than reading all the negativity or the bad news, in the center spread are the most amazing pictures called Eyewitness. And if you don't know about it, I highly recommend that you subscribe to the Guardian, which is an independent source of some amazing press. And the kind of photography that is featured in The Guardian is always first class, so thank you for that. And we do have an artist on board here. Hannah Starkey is a fine art photographer with a point of view and an attitude about a feminist gaze in so much of the work that she's done over the years, which she will tell you about. What we're going to be doing tonight is actually having a conversation, not about just the female gaze and artists that have been selected to talk about, but as importantly, everyone is going to, that is on the panel, actually share with you their journey, what their journey has been all about, and the earliest days of what perhaps masked what the challenges were for female and their gaze and how they look at things. I think one of the most important thing about the female gaze is in a personal view, is the difference of a man perhaps looking at a situation and how they're going to photograph it versus a female, and what their attitudes are, whether it is in conflict, whether it's dealing in social issues and things about identity, and the vulnerability of a woman, whether they're in a war zone or just generally speaking, how they are being viewed by the wider public, what is their conversation versus how a male may also have the same topic but a different point of view. And certainly women over the years, their view, their take on photography has had tremendous impact and triggered change in most cases for the good. So let's kick it off with Shoair. She's the director of the Photographers Gallery, and talk about what the Photographers Gallery is doing, what they're planning, but as importantly, Shoair's journey.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you for hosting this evening. I thought I'd start by just sharing a little bit about my background and how I got into the photography industry, how I became a curator, and how I ended up as the director of the Photographers Gallery. I have a really long history of photography, so it's kind of part of the family business. My uncle was a press photographer in Beirut during the Civil War. He also worked in portrait studios, and he's the person that taught me how to print in a dark room. When I was still a child, I was about 10 or 11 years old. And then when I was a teenager, I started working in neighborhood mini labs. So really like getting hands-on with the practicality of photography and understanding photography, understanding that a photograph is many different things. It's a family snapshot, it's something you see in a newspaper, and it's something you see in an art gallery. And those things are materially the same, but also very, very different. So I then studied fine art photography at university. And luckily, I think very early on, I realized I wasn't a very good photographer. And what that allowed me to do was to kind of step away from that and think about all of the other ways that you can work with photography without being a photographer. So I started working in museums, and from there became a curator and eventually ended up being a director. So I guess what's really interesting about the panel tonight is these three different perspectives. And I think you'll see that we're going to present very different things, actually. And that's all part of like this big ecosystem of what photography is. So I've worked in many different organizations. I was at Tate Modern for 10 years, doing like really kind of mainstream museum exhibitions. I was then the director of PhotoWorks, which is a small grassroots not-for-profit that focuses mainly on commissioning. And then now as the director of the Photographers Gallery, it's somewhere in between those two things. And I wanted to just highlight some of the ways that we really try, and particularly throughout my career, I've tried to highlight the work of women who have been historically underrepresented in the museum context. So the first artist I wanted to talk about was Evelyn Hofer. Born in Germany, lived in Switzerland, Madrid, Mexico, and then finally New York. Born in 1922, so part of that movement early on in her life was escaping Nazi Germany. What's really interesting about Evelyn Hofer's work is she had this very long career, and there's like this really famous quote about her that she's the best known unknown photographer. So lots of photographers knew who she was and were influenced by her, but very few members of the public would recognize her name. So at the Photographers Gallery this summer, we are going to host the first solo retrospective of her work in the UK. And really, you know, she died in 2009, so she had this really, really long career, was super accomplished in what she made, but never really had the exhibition recognition that she deserved in this country. And just some kind of really interesting things about her work. She worked in between black and white and color photography. She was really like a pioneer in color photography. And a lot of the people that you would recognize the names of, people like Thomas Struth, Joel Sternfeld, Adam Bartos, Reneke Dijkstra, Alex Soth, these kind of like icons of color photography from the 20th century, they were directly influenced and talk about how they were directly influenced by Evelyn Hofer. So really that kind of speaks to the importance of her as a figure in the history of photography that has huge influence, but not the name recognition. And these are just a few of her works.
Can I just stop you there? I'm curious, Shoair. You're featuring an artist that probably on the wider public is unaware of, except for photographers on the inside that might have studied it. Do you think it's a bit brave to do that in launching someone that is relatively unknown? And what was the inspiration to actually feature her work as a solo show?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't take credit for it because it was programmed before I took over, actually. But it's part of a wider kind of vision to emphasize and give solo shows to figures that have been overlooked. And the people that have been overlooked are primarily women and primarily people of color and primarily international people from the global south. So that's really something that the Photographers Gallery will continue to do over the next few years.
That's very good news.
Yes. And like super overdue, right? This should have been happening a very long time ago. So what was interesting about Hofer is that she worked between a commercial landscape and her own practice. She photographed a lot for kind of the big name magazines, a lot of commissions. And she kind of has this niche of photographing cities. So she would go to a city and she would make a huge body of work of a particular location and really focusing on the people that were in that urban landscape and how they kind of spent time in the urban landscape. A lot of the time that was in the US, where she lived for the majority of her life. But then it was also kind of traveling around the world on assignment, so for magazine commissions or for book commissions, and photographing in places like Dublin or Florence or other cities around Europe. And you can see like the kind of vibrancy in her color work. It's pretty incredible. And all of these were made in the 60s. So when color photography was like quite niche and really only used in commercial, really only used in like commercial practice, it wasn't something that you would see in a museum or gallery. And the second artist I wanted to talk about was Sabine Weiss. So kind of around the same age as Evelyn Hofer, actually, born in 1924 and died just 2 years ago in 2021. And again, another figure from the 20th century that has been overlooked. And you can see, like, this is not radical work, right? Evelyn Hofer's work is quite traditional. Sabine Weiss's work is quite traditional. It's not that they were overlooked because they were being super radical in what they were making. They're just names that we don't really know so much about.
And overlooked by the men that were making the decisions of what was going to be featured in media or particularly in galleries and museums. They had almost no voice. They were silent.
Yeah, and that kind of changed for Sabine Weiss at the very end of her life. She had a solo retrospective in 2021 at the Rencontre in Arles. And that subsequently toured around Europe. And like, interestingly, when you look back over her biography, there were moments in the 20th century where she was exhibited. She was in the Family of Man exhibition that toured the world in 1955. And she was exhibited at the MoMA in New York in the 50s as well. So like, she was there, but maybe just not as prominently as some of the others. And her kind of niche was really photographing post-war European cities and photographing the kind of the urban decay and the joy of these post-war European cities. And this image in particular, she talked about a lot as this being her most, her favorite and most well-known image that wasn't a commission. This is something that she made as part of her personal work. And it's really kind of the spirit of the city, these kind of fringes of the outskirts of the city in a post-war. And yeah, really kind of like classic, beautiful things. The print sales gallery at the Photographers Gallery represent her as an artist, and it's really amazing to bring someone like her on to join that group of artists. And yeah, I added the image of the cat just because it's quite fantastic. And you can see like a lot of this was done for newspaper and magazine work as well. She was publishing for Vogue and the New York Times and Life magazine.
When you look at the last picture with the cat coming through the gating there, do you think that who she might have been influenced to? She's a French artist, and do you think Cartier-Bresson might have had a small impact in her style, particularly a picture like that?
Yeah, and I mean, she was like a contemporary of all these people, particularly Brassai, and was working, yeah, definitely in the same vein. She also has an image of someone jumping over a puddle.
But it's just that kind of your nose twitches with a bit of pleasure because it's tongue-in-cheek and it's a bit amusing and it's exquisitely executed, of course.
Exactly. I just wanted to end by talking a little bit about the contemporary, to kind of bookend these two quite historic figures. So my previous role at PhotoWorks, we did a lot of commissioning, and part of my role as a curator and a director is to really make sure that when we do that commissioning, we're giving opportunities to women, and really making sure that that's a priority. So this is an installation shot of the work of Heather Agupong, who was one of the most recent Jowood PhotoWorks awardees. That's an early career opportunity for photographers that are in the first 10 years of their practice. And actually, in the history of this award, there has been more women commissioned than men, so there's about a 70-30 split, which is fantastic, but it also represents the kind of demographic of people that are graduating universities in the UK studying photography, so it's a natural split as well.
Thanks, Shoair. Our next speaker is Fiona with The Guardian, and I'm just going to hand it over to you because you're the one.
Well, is my microphone on? Yeah. It's just okay, so I started in photography about 30 years ago. Originally, I trained as a journalist, but very kind of swiftly found that I was actually quite a rubbish writer. And you know what? It's fine to just, admit that and move on to your strengths. And mine was much more in visual storytelling. And I was working doing sort of layout and picture selection on magazines, etc., before I made my way into a newsroom. I did start on a current affairs magazine. It was actually Police Review, so you can imagine that was quite sort of, male heavy in those days.
But Fiona, you were saying is that you were almost the only female voice when you started in the newsroom.
Absolutely. So in the newsroom, it was quite a tough environment, and I think what I've learned looking back is that I felt a lot of the time like I had to hide my femininity to a degree and kind of, play the game according to the men's rules. And I don't feel like that now. I mean, our newsroom is much broader in demographic, and I have peers who are women. It's okay to, kind of admit the backdrop of your family life, for example, as a woman. And I think that's, changed for the better for all of us. And it's wonderful that we can kind of mentor one another through the complications of perhaps, being a mother, for example, as well as, having quite a sort of a complex job and role in the workplace. So a lot has changed for the better. But certainly in the world of kind of photojournalism and documentary, we've still got a long way to go because we're still having this conversation about how we encourage women into this space, particularly as photographers rather than as picture editors. There's a really interesting organisation called Women Photograph. Some of you probably know a deal about Women Photograph, but it's a collective who have tried to support one another in a kind of sisterly way and encourage picture editors to find a resource of contacting female photographers and non-binary photographers as well.
Can I ask you a question just on that subject? In your early days and with The Guardian commissioning photographers, did you ever look at, well, this story is probably more male-oriented, and this story I probably should target a woman to cover? Have you ever had that mindset?
I do think that has happened, actually, and that there may be situations perhaps where we're photographing women who have maybe been the victims of domestic violence or have suffered in some way that we might consider it's more appropriate to ask a woman to do that job. Interestingly as well, I think perhaps my male predecessors would not have considered asking women to go and photograph conflict. And now absolutely, the question I would ask to any photographer is, would you be happy to go and do this job, regardless of your gender or any other specifics about your situation? It's really up to the individual whether they want to go and do that. And in fact, we've commissioned a lot of women to photograph for us in Ukraine lately. And so I was going to show you the work of some of the female photographers in photojournalism that I particularly admire. And the clicker is here, so hopefully I can make this work by pressing down. Right. First of all, I wanted to show you the work of Zora Ben Samra. So Zora Ben Samra works for Reuters, and she's traveled to a lot of conflict zones, but she is so unique because she's Algerian and she was the first ever female photojournalist in Algeria. She when she was a child, she was following in the footsteps of her brother, who had an interest in photography. And at the time, you know, it was seen as very much not the thing that the little girl in the family should ever consider doing. And in fact, her older brothers were quite cross with her when she showed this interest. But, you know, she blazed her own trail and found her way onto the local newspaper, where she convinced her editors to allow her to go and photograph some of the civil unrest that was happening in Algeria at the time. And since then, she has gone on to really kind of use that experience that she got then, and also her sense of of having lived very traumatic times herself, to take incredibly empathetic photographs of people in conflict, and particularly to find her way into the space of women and children. This photograph was taken in Mosul as people were fleeing ISIS there. And this photograph was taken after a student was killed by the Taliban after a school attack, and the family are grieving in Pakistan. And I mean, we do see photographs of, you know, grieving families, for example, quite intimate photographs taken by men. But you will notice that this is a space where the women are grieving, and it's unlikely in that society that anybody other than a woman would have been able to have access to this particular scene. And this is a wedding that Zora photographed at a refugee camp for Syrian refugees in Turkey. And I mean, so there is absolutely no doubt that she has a place in, you know, she is a world-class photojournalist, and her work proves that. But I think that she also brings an incredibly tender eye to her photographs. And as I say, this is a really kind of common theme, that women are able to find their way into spaces that men would not be able to photograph in.
And do you think, I agree with that from personal experience and other people talking about it, one of the things I was thinking about is, do you think the female gaze and coming from a nurturing soul makes a difference in terms of how they interact with people when, and particularly in a situation like that, in a conflict area, when you're dealing with grieving and other traumatic events? Do you think their nurturing soul contributes to how they create their imagery?
I certainly think in some circumstances it can. I mean, it's a huge generalization to say that, you know, women have that nurturing soul and men don't, and I don't think that's entirely right.
Okay.
But I do think that there is an opportunity sometimes for a slightly gentler approach in certain circumstances, and when you're talking about you know, kind of winning people's trust, with the trust of you know, your fellow women, especially in very patriarchal societies, really only women can do that. And if we want to report the world in a balanced way, then absolutely the women photographers have to have a place in it. Interestingly, we still find that only 20% of documentary photographers are women. Even although, you know, a lot of women attend photo documentary courses, it's still incredibly difficult for women to, you know, to operate. And part of that may be because, you know, editors don't consider that they should be sent into difficult situations. This is a really interesting story, and it's told by Foru Alahi, who is a young Iranian photographer. And she has told a story here, which has won a World Press Award, actually, and it's a story about women football supporters in Iran. So already it's quite difficult for women photographers to operate in Iran. But the story that she's chosen to tell is really quite controversial and possibly seen as very kind of critical of the regime there. She photographed her friend Zainab, who's a great football supporter. Zainab's a young woman who enjoys playing football herself with some of her friends, but she wanted to go to a football match, and most football matches in Iran are men only. So women are not welcome in that space. So you just would not believe what they did. They dressed up as boys. I mean, it's astonishing. But not only Zainab, but also the photographer herself, they dressed up as boys in order to make this story. and so that Zainab could go and watch the team. Now, the other really fascinating thing about this, when you read into the detail of it, is the men that are around Zainab, they know she's a girl. They know that she's had to dress up, and they accept that that's what she's had to do. So, but they won't oppose the regime in order for her to enter that space, but they will accept her as a dressed up, as a woman dressed as a boy. I mean, it's such a curious thing, but again, this is a story that could only be told by a woman about a woman. And this picture is taken in the stadium where, on occasion, women-only areas have been, segregated, and the women were so overjoyed to be invited in to watch football in the stadium that they were weeping with emotion at being allowed into this space. And some of them actually had said, "We didn't really want to even go and watch the football. We just wanted to go into the stadium because we're not allowed in there." So, and I just want to say as well that I really think this photographer is so brave, because at any point she could be the target of her regime for making this kind of work. And finally, I wanted to mention Lindsay Addario. I mean, many of you may know the name of the photographer Lindsay Addario. She is actually quite legendary in our business. She's made astonishing photographs for over 20 years, and has absolutely kind of entered a space that people thought that she would not necessarily be welcome. She did so in the beginning because she was working with female journalists, actually, and that's how she kind of made her way as a photo documentarist. But she's made some quite interesting quotes. I mean, this story that she has made is about women's maternal health. And again, really only a woman could do that.
You know what, I'd love for you to also share with the audience is the idea when Lindsay was pregnant and she was working in a conflict area, and how people around her were thinking, how dare her go into a conflict area also responsible for
a child, yeah. And that's quite interesting, because I've got a little note to mention that, because so Lindsay was criticised for being, a pregnant woman going to, I think she was perhaps in Libya at the time. And she said, her response to that was, she said, look, I became pregnant and I was terrified because I wanted to keep making the work, and I knew that I would face severe criticism for being, either pregnant or being a mum. And her quote really was, at the time there were no role models. Nobody else was really kind of doing, in my situation, doing what I do. And she said, there are male journalists, and this is such a good point, who get killed with children at home, and nobody says what were they doing in a war zone. So, it shouldn't necessarily be the reason that you shouldn't go. And I also think that, what's reflected in her work as well is this idea that you can make your way into intimate spaces. You can tell women's stories that were not being told before. This is at a refugee camp just over the Turkish border for Syrian refugees. And this woman has just had a baby in Ukraine. She's in Lviv. She's been moved into an underground shelter because it's not safe for her to be in the hospital. And the other thing I wanted, this is quite interesting. So Lindsay, when she started going to document conflict, it was at a time when the US military did not allow women on the front line. And so, but she was on the front line. And now she's been back and she's been photographing women who are now taking their place in armed conflict. And so she's been kind of quite prolific in telling that story as well. And then finally, I wanted to show you this picture because it's really powerful, but in all honesty, I don't think you could look at this and say whether it was taken by a man or a woman. And actually, that's also quite important because a lot of the women photographers you speak to, they say, we don't want to be the woman photographer. We just want to be the photographer. And it's almost like unbelievable that we've been having this conversation for decades now, and we're still talking about it, and we're still trying to open up these spaces. And by the way, I think it's really great that we've got some men here this evening because we can't just talk to ourselves about this. You all have to be part of this conversation. It's really important.
Absolutely correct. And the last line that you said, the idea the first woman photographer to be in the ditches and so on. And it's so true. And when are we going to break away from that barrier? And when are we going to have an opportunity? Who is best suited to shoot something and cover a story and based on their talent rather than their gender?
Exactly that.
We've got a long way to go. Hannah, your journey, and you're on, girl.
Hello, everybody. Is that on?
Green light.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Right.
Has it got a green button on your mic?
There we go.
Trading
How
places.
sisters help each other, especially with big phallic things in front of their face. Anyway, I'm a photographer. I started 25 years ago. Well, I graduated 25 years ago. And my God, I've seen amazing changes in the industry, in our visual culture in general, since women have fought their way in, really, and fought their way to stay. 25 years ago, it was still a male-dominated industry. I was very lucky because my degree show at the Royal College, which was literally a handful of pictures, it got a lot of attention. And this is 97, this is before online or social media, that kind of thing. And it just seemed to go out to a lot of places in the world and bring back different opportunities. So for the beginning of my career, I was just asked to do things based on the work that I had produced. And I've never really wanted to be, how can I say this, aggressively pursuing a career. That actually doesn't interest me very much. I'm not interested in fame and I'm not interested in fortune. And that seemed to be the value then. I thought it was a very male way of thinking about spending your life with medium that you love, that you're also responsible for who's in your pictures. But I think really because I had a very good start right in at the top, that you really couldn't challenge me that much. How can I say this? I didn't have the struggle. I didn't have the initial struggle. The struggle came afterwards. But I had been through photography education in the late 80s. I'd come from Belfast, and I loved growing up in Belfast, wild place, with amazing women. I was surrounded by amazing women who did historical things like, win Nobel Peace Prizes or organise demonstrations for peace and bringing two sides of the community, in Belfast case, Catholics and Protestants, together. They were fearless, and I loved their fearless, kick-ass attitude. So I think that's always been with me, this idea of, women make a lot more sense in conflict situations, and maybe we should listen to them and bring their voices to the table. And it's funny when you grow up in that kind of environment because you just know it to be true. So when you get out into the world, in my case, the mid-80s and the 90s in education, I just couldn't believe how undervalued and undersold women were. And as a woman, I was also aware of how I was being targeted through advertising, and it was billboards then and magazines, and almost being told how to be as a woman, which struck me as really unusual. I mean, I just didn't understand why anyone would have the right to dictate to me as a human being how to be my gender. So I would say the whole of my career was actually, how can I say this? It was a reaction against my, how can I say this? It was a reaction against how my work and success was perceived. So you would get if you had a show on and you had a critic that was critiquing your work, which was mainly male, they never got it. That was the thing that always amazed me. They always said, yes, Hannah Starkey's women, Pictures of women are sad, isolated, lonely, vulnerable. And I looked at my pictures and I thought, hold on, my pictures are of women in a photographic space that do not care about the camera. They don't care about having to work for your gaze, which then was, for me, the male gaze. They're in their own space, doing their own thing. They are, for me, it was about solitude. It was about being deep in thought. It was about, there was so much more going on than that was in the surface. And somehow, as a woman, and a young woman, I had to perform the surface bit, which really I never did particularly well. So right from the beginning, and an education in the mid-'80s, and I had a great education, actually. I went to Napier University. It just became a university. And it was a vocational course in photography. It was 4 years because it was in Scotland. And I learned everything about photography. The point was that you would come out of this degree and able to work as a photographer. You would be able to get a job. So we did lots of different modules like fashion photography, documentary, photojournalism, still life. You get the gist of what I'm saying. You learn how to do everything.
Can I just stop you there? I want to ask, Hannah, because I haven't seen all your work. I know quite a bit from the retrospect that you had, but all the imagery that I've seen that you have created has a woman in it and women, rather than there's no young boys, there's no men. There seems to be a focus on the woman. And was that, when you were at university, focusing on that as well, as starting to build the DNA in your brand of photography? A bit of a feminist, to say the least.
Yeah, it was the reaction as to why there were no men in my pictures. And somehow, you know, female subject matter was ghettoized in the same way that photography was ghettoized in the art world. So it did seem very subversive to only photograph women and take on the title of a female photographer and interested in the female gaze. I mean, I think, you know, what's interesting about when you look at a career that spans, hopefully, a lifetime, that, you know, that things shift in decades, you know, in years, things shift, people's priorities shift. But I was very aware that casual sexism had been in the world for a long time, and we had negated and omitted women's voices. And for me, that was massively problematic because we weren't getting a balanced view. Women were being kind of overlooked in health, all sorts of areas. And it sort of made me angry and defiant. So I just decided to, in a time when fairly male-dominated industry, I'm thinking of places like Magnum and, you know, because I worked across the board, really, in different outlets of photography. It really made me sad that women weren't allowed to say they were female photographers, because that was like a slight. That was something that, oh, you wouldn't want a female driver, or you would, that kind of attitude of women weren't as great as their male counterparts was still very much there. So I decided to call myself a female photographer, and I wasn't even that conscious, really. It was just a reaction. And to only photograph women. And you'd be amazed how dangerous that is, because you are effectively pushing on the status quo. And my images are they're quiet, they're not sensationalized in any way, really. They're beautiful, but they don't necessarily rely on a woman's beauty. So it's more about what the medium can do and how I see in photography that really kind of guided me through what I was interested in and why it was only women, you know. There is something about excluding men that really pisses men off back then. And rightly so, but you know, I had the will and the way to change things, so that's what I tried to do. and I've kind of shot ahead of myself here because we were asked to talk about photographers, and mine are from the 20th century. And they're the photographers that during my education, my vocational training in photography, I learned about. And I did find that I graduated more towards female photographers because there was something that spoke to me in how they saw the world. And I think now if you think about the male gaze was the dominant gaze, and to some extent still is, but it's turned into something else, not necessarily the male gaze. What I was doing then was trying to push forward the idea that women possibly, actually I think they have a different way of looking at things in the way that it's your own lived experience. You know what you're talking about to a certain extent, obviously not all women, but as a kind of general experience of being female in the world.
When you say female in the world, when you say female in the world, I was just thinking the idea of it being more personal, and more raw meat on the table, so to speak, you know, the exposure of your own emotions about things as reflected visually, and that women are more comfortable in their skin to be able to show that vulnerability, let's say, that doesn't look like a weakness compared to a man.
Yeah, and women got a hard time for that, you know? You never wanted to, like, talk about intuition in the same sentence as a woman because it was sort of laughed at, you know, intuition, empathy, all these kind of soft power, which is actually where we're at now and what we really need. And but also the kind of the female gaze. There are many gazes now, and the platforms that are opening up because of well, really because women are in the industry and they're advocating for other women, and women have always been inclusive. It depends what your personal experience or background is, but for me, women have always been inclusive because you need equality to have a better world. And if everyone isn't at the table, then there is no best photographer or greatest photographer in the world or any of those things, because the criteria on which it's being judged is, you know, skewed. It's not balanced. So talking about 25 years and seeing what's changed, I think it's quite amazing. And I think, I mean, photography became the language in which we communicate with, and we are hearing far more about people and their experiences in life that we didn't know to ask before, really. And being a woman at that time felt fairly much the same way. So the three photographers I can really remember being educated by was Louise Dell Wolfe, who was, they're all 20th century. She worked for Harper's Bazaar mostly. And she taught me that you can photograph, and bearing in mind the context, Harper's Bazaar, it is all skinny white women. But she also taught me that the beauty in an image of a woman does not need to rely necessarily on her beauty. I mean, Louise Dell Wolfe was an extraordinary, sensitive, creative photographer and didn't rely on, I guess, just the woman being the picture. She relied, for me, on this kind of emotional intelligence and this appreciation of beauty that was outside the objectification of a woman. And then we had, how come you don't want to go? Yeah, that's Louise Dell Wolfe, so you can see how kick-ass that woman was. I have great respect for her. And then we had Helen Levitt, again, you know, the way she did street photography and the way she photographed women and children, again, really spoke to me. And this particular picture about the female form and it's such a sculptural picture that it educates my eye almost beyond photography as well. And then there was Lee Miller, who I remember when I was first introduced to her, it was a very strong narrative of she'd been a model and she'd been discovered by a man and she'd been saved by a man, and then she was a lover of a man, and then she assisted this man. And I was like, God, that for me is the epitome of what I want. I want independence, and I don't want to be labeled as a muse or something other than a photographer. So I remember when I was younger being told her story, and I'm rolling my eyes and thinking women have to play these games. And then I got the real education where I actually really looked at her work and the breadth of subject matter, her fearlessness, particularly in a war, towards the end of the war and going into the concentration camps after the Americans moved in. I just hated this narrative about how she had to be beautiful to be important, when actually her work was extraordinarily important, and her talent, how she could just cross genres and discover new processes and still have to try and negotiate this past her male counterparts.
With Lee Miller, as we know, we're talking World War II, and especially the work that she did when so many of the men, when they went into the concentration camps and what they had discovered, which repelled people, she was there to document. She was there as a force to say, don't forget what happened here. Look, when others were looking away. And I thought that was astonishingly insightful for her to have the vision beyond what she was actually visualizing and seeing in front of herself, saying, I need to document this. I need to show the world what has happened there. And that's so many years ago. This is 1945.
Well, they are, yeah. But it is how they stepped out of, when nothing was expected of them because they were, pioneers. But I guess how photography history is written about these women also interests me. When we were talking about Helen Levitt, what I loved about Helen Levitt was she wasn't in your face ever, and she really believed that the photography should do the work. And that is something I have always believed, that there's something so beautiful about making one image that people remember and gets sent out to the world and has a kind of a life of its own, and isn't because people know who the photographer is, or isn't because it's being hyped or kind of marketed in a particular way. It's that pure form of photography without any kind of context or anchor or famous photographer behind it or any of that shit. That's for me what motivates me in photography, is the pure power of the medium itself. We are now bombarded with images, so I'm not sure it kind of can translate in the same way today. But yeah, for me, all those women were role models and offered something of an insight to how to be a photographer as a young female photography student. It was very 20th century, and yeah, I'm always finding female photographers that I didn't know about, and I have become a female photographer that people don't know about. It's really interesting how...
Yeah, but the conversation, when I'm listening to the language and what we've been talking about, we never say he was a male photographer, ever. I don't...
No, but I do get why. How come I've never heard of her?
When are we going to get over the idea she's a female photographer versus, when you're talking about Cartier-Bresson, you say Cartier-Bresson was a man. No, you just say, look at his work and look what he's done. But we're still using that language. Well, maybe we have to start rethinking how we express ourselves and not, I don't actually say I'm a female photographer ever. I just say I'm a documentary photographer. This is the kind of work that I cover, and never use the word female as a prefix to describing the kind of work I'm engaged in. And I think we have to start thinking about that. And I would love everybody to comment. What do you think, Shoair?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one because you can also use it to your advantage to garner press, PR, all of those type of things. So I think it's about understanding when and how to use those labels?
I mean, mine would have been at the time when it became very important to me. It was a negative, definitely, but it's a negative in a different way now. That's fine.
Well,
The world moves
Fiona,
on.
what do you think?
The microphone's working.
Oh,
I think
yeah,
it
yeah.
is. No, it is. I've got it. Yeah, I mean, I also agree with Shoair. I think there are times when, we do use our femininity for a particular purpose, and that's fine. And I also think that probably, men use their masculinity at certain times too. But I am conscious of this, kind of desire for us to, to drop the female photographer thing and just kind of accept people. But there has got to be a degree of positive action until we get to that place.
Well, you're right. When we think that it's only 20% of the world that is engaged, particularly in photojournalism, and that is high compared to even when I started out 20 years ago, where the population of the British Professional Press Association, 6% were female.
Yeah.
6.
Yeah, so we're baby steps, but we're not there. And I do think that means that we need to be very proactive about lifting, women and people of different ethnic minorities and different lived experiences to say, you are welcome in this space. This is for you. Why wouldn't it be? And I just don't think we've quite got there yet. So we just need to keep talking about it.
Well, we're running low on time now. One of the things I wanted to ask everyone here was the idea. You've all described your journey and the challenges and what's inspired you and so on. What do you, if you had to say one short, sharp idea about what you would recommend for us to move forward, the female gaze, and for more women to be engaged and to think about what they're going to be participating, whether with all genres of photography, not just one single one. What would you say the major challenges are, and what should they be doing on their journey?
Well,
Fiona?
I do think two things. First of all, accept that there will be challenges. Okay, you may not get a very easy ride, and there will be certain obstacles and preconceptions about you along the way. So accept that will happen, so that you are kind of equipped to deal with it. And also we must not stop discussing this and taking the positive action.
Well, I didn't feel I had to accept any of it, to be honest. I felt that, it's interesting, a good photograph has the ability to quieten all those kind of isms. And it can transcend your gender or race or... So I would say... stand your ground, actually, because you're really important. That we cannot work out of one way of seeing the world, i.e., the prism through the prism of the male gaze. And the tougher it is, the more exciting it is. Really, ultimately, what you're looking for as a photographer is autonomy, agency. And there was a third one, which I can't remember, which are always really important to me. And it's the fact that no one can tell you what to do, unless, of course, it's an assignment or something. That you do your own thing, whether it's fashionable or not fashionable, on trend, whatever. I think if it's coming from you and I don't know. I mean, my work comes from love and respect from women. So that's what I hope that it channels and communicates. And I think maybe that's probably how we think about photography now, in that everyone it is now a case of who gets to tell the picture, who's behind the camera, who's in front of the lens, where is the power. All those questions are being asked by a much wider demographic than ever before. So, and you can see how it's reflected in our visual culture. We're in a much better place in terms of how women And you've got intersectionality, and there's a whole lot of things that would take about an hour to talk about. But I think we're in a much healthier place visually.
Well, that's really good news, considering that collectively we probably have 60 years of experience built, with mine the longest, sitting here. But going forward, one of the things I've observed, and it's a separate conversation and another kind of a talk, is the openness, particularly amongst women, to be able to be vulnerable in the space of photography. And I'm thinking particularly about Haley Morris Cafario's work, which, she was being bullied online because of her weight and a whole host of other things. And yet she went out and was what I call raw meat on the table, exposing who she was and miming who the people that were bullying her online. And I think that was very brave. And I don't think that would have happened 20 years ago. Not that the people weren't there to do it, but they wouldn't have thought, who would want to even look at it? Who wants to understand that kind of imagery and storytelling, which was, a setup documentary about her personal experiences. So yes, we've come up to a certain point, but I think we need to push the envelope a lot further than we've been able to do. And that is to open up the minds of people to reflect well, I think, of certainly in the media, and we're celebrating, I use the word celebrating, World Press Freedom Day tomorrow. And it's the freedom to express yourself and the freedom to have, as you were saying, not just gender equality, but walking up and down the economic path that we are. It's not just for the elitist that is engaged in photography, and global. The voices on a global stage are important, particularly the work that you were showing, Fiona, about women that aren't well respected and aren't given voices just on a normal level, and yet the bravery they've had to photograph their worlds, and particularly love the stadium. That was absolutely fantastic.
It's an astonishing story, isn't it?
Yeah,
really astonishing.
It is, and it's amazing. Where did she get the inspiration and the courage to go out and do something completely? I think we wound up on time. If anyone has any questions, I think everyone will be delighted to answer.
It's a question for Shoair. If Sabina Wise and Evelyn Hofer, had commissions from Vogue and you said Life, then you could one say they were hardly neglected. And I suppose it leads into another question, really, which is given the kind of decline of the power of newspapers and magazines, and this goes back to actually to sort of like Vogue, where that sort of fashion photography remains such a powerful economic base, because we've talked a lot about tonight about obviously great pictures, and that's really wonderful, but obviously the economic value of images has declined with the kind of iPhone. Does that have a push in terms of, we're talking about the female gaze, but obviously it's such a kind of economic power, these magazines, they're all that remain really of the kind of magazine world. And how does that then impact upon, I don't know anything about female fashion photographers or that whole genre, the fact that it is still the economic draw, or is it it must still be a huge economic draw, the power, where other photographies, like documentary photography, newspaper photography, they've all economically declined. And what does that mean?
Yeah. Interesting question. I'll answer the first part first. So yes, Evelyn Hofer and Sabine Weiss were being commissioned by really mainstream magazines. So yeah, they were part of that world, but they didn't, for whatever reason, cross over into the museum and gallery world and get those solo shows or have that gallery representation and sell their work in that gallery context. So in one respect, yeah, they were pretty well known and they were doing well, but in the other context, they weren't. And on the second point, I mean, I don't really know much about magazine commissioning or the economics of it, or fashion photography or the economics of it. But what I will say is like a much broader kind of point around, if we think about all of the photographs that were taken up until the year 2000, or even up until the year 2010, the vast majority of those, whether it was a travel magazine, a fashion magazine, or any other kind of commercial imagery that was circulating around the globe, 98% of that was photographed by a man. So when you think of the legacy of that, there is 150 years of images that have been taken by men circulating the world, and that is our cultural references. That is what photography's cultural references, mainstream photography. And actually, if you think about social media and digital photography, what that has done, you could argue that what that has done is democratized who is taking images. And the users, the amount of men and women users on Instagram, for example, is more or less equal. So there is a huge like before and after moment. And that also has huge economic impacts on commissioning and the magazine world. But I don't really know about that.
Thank you, Shoair. Any other questions? Sorry. Any other questions? I had turned it off.
I have a question for Fiona. Obviously, you process thousands of photographs a year, which are published, which is very important. Now, I think we must have agreed that photography should get forward, not on colour, not on gender, but on merit. Have you ever thought of processing those photographs without looking at the name of who shot them, and then publishing the name afterwards?
So that is a really interesting question. I think a lot of the sort of photography competitions that we're all involved in, you don't see the photographer's name, and that's for that reason, that it's the idea that it's the best photography rises to the surface. But I do think that sometimes if you are missing somebody's gender or their ethnicity or their particular kind of lived experience, you're often not picking up the nuance of what you're looking at. And also, I mean, I have to say, like, we go through an astonishing number of pictures every day. At The Guardian, we receive more than 30,000 pictures a day come into our picture desk. I mean, it's just kind of slightly bonkers, but we in teams, we kind of sift through everything to try and find, the best pictures. And it's true to say that the best do rise to the surface. But in terms of representation, it is really important that we want the people to have taken those photographs to be representative of their communities and of a variety of lived experiences. Otherwise, we don't believe that we can really report on our world in a kind of fair and just way. So knowing who those photographers are is actually part of the story. And one of the difficulties we have is that we subscribe to, the big news agencies who are still lagging a bit behind in who they employ as their photographers. And so often if so we are at the mercy of their kind of 20% women thing. And we try to redress that with who we employ directly on commissions at The Guardian, and we tend to employ local photographers in various parts of the world, rather than kind of parachuting in somebody from the UK. And again, that helps to bring more balance to the story.
But your 20% women is positive discrimination. It's nothing to do with merit. If you're told to choose 20% women, that's positive discrimination.
Yeah, and I have spoken about positive action today, and I do think it's important. If we don't take some positive action, you are not encouraging people to feel that they're welcome in the space, that it's not a job for them. They feel excluded, and so it's something they wouldn't even consider. And
then probably it's not just dealing with gender, but across the broad spectrum.
Yeah. And by the way, women and people from different backgrounds do take good pictures. So they're not pushing out the great photographers, they're joining them.
Any further questions from the audience? And anyone online? Is anyone asking online? My God, such a controversial subject, and we have no questions. Maybe all the questions were answered in the conversations. I want to thank our panelists for coming along today, and thank you so much for presenting and contributing to the conversation about the woman's gaze. And thank you all for coming here tonight. And thank you very much, Conduit Club and Pranvera.
I just think we should mention Hannah's exhibition.
Yes, Hannah has a, can I just show the book that I have here now? It's just in that bag. I'm a big fan of Hannah's work, and we're also friends as well. And I went to an extraordinary exhibition, a retrospective of her work, which was at the Hepworth in Wakefield. We were organized. There were about 50 of us that went up for the exhibition. And Hannah gave us the most amazing personal tour, explaining to all her photographic friends and so on of how her work evolved. And the imagery and the presentation was absolutely knockout, and it was extraordinary. So where is all your work now, Hannah, and where can we come and visit you?
Well, the Hepworth closed yesterday, and I had to go up and say goodbye to it. It's, you know, because each image, it sort of comes from a certain type of struggle or search for something. So there, you know, I work in single images, and everything in that single image that I'm feeling and then kind of communicating with my subject matter, which is female, means a lot. You know, for 25 years, I'm making 50 pictures, which is a terrible average. You know, there's, I mean, I know they said there's a lot of photographer in their image, obviously, and you can sometimes tell what kind of person the photographer is by looking at an image. Not always. But I think mine have been consistently trying to, throughout my life, find out what does it mean to be a young woman. I am a young woman, I'll make photographs about this. What does it mean to be a mother of daughters? I'll make photographs about this. What does it mean to be an older woman in a society where you're not allowed to age?
You're not old.
So whatever, I can give a shit. Experienced, wise. Those sort of things are very interesting to me. So, you know, I would say that my privilege lies in being left alone to make a lifetime body of work. You know, really, that's really all I'm interested in. So you've missed the Hepworth, but this exhibition is in Belfast. It's in the Ulster Museum, and it was, like I was saying at the beginning of my introduction, I've always been really inspired by strong working class women, came from that. And this was a 25 years anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and you know, like the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement omitted women, and particularly Mo Molan, who was instrumental in bringing peace to Northern Ireland. So I just thought, fuck that. And I made my own. And these are 21 women, because that's as many we could get in the gallery wall. But they're women from all walks of life. They're just women who care. And, you know, even though they've been active all their life, and if you meet a woman who's been an activist all her life, she's bloody exhausted by the time she gets to 80. So a lot of these women ranged from, they were kind of more towards older women, and I miss older women in our world, and the weight of knowledge and wisdom that they have. I know it's very generalizing, and you know, but I do think that we are being undermined on so many different levels through our visual culture. So to have the opportunity to photograph real women that did real things and make them monumental, they were all massively embarrassed, because these are women who don't want the spotlight. They just get on with the job. But it's very important for younger women from the that see this generation of women and know what they achieved. So this was 21 women who were active at that period running up to 90 Good Friday Agreement, but they're actually about all women. It's to say thank you to the women that were there at that time, but also the generations that have come after, because they have different issues they have to face now. You know, misogyny, patriarchal systems, violence, you know, this. So it was trying to make an image that showed a woman's power, but not being judgmental or scrutinizing. So I devised a way of photographing them where they would actually radiate rather than, you know, look at them. And because I find it really hard to photograph women these days because we've lost our confidence, and the camera can be a very exploitative, in your face technology, and I try and look after them in that process.
So how long is the show going to be up?
Till September.
And when are you going to be there so we can all come up and get a private tour?
Well, the reason for this also was to, you know, because it was going to be a global event. After 25 years later, suddenly the spotlights returned to Belfast, media spotlights. And, you know, this is a peace process that is held, which is remarkable. And it is held because of the amount of women that were at the table or behind the table or just there, really, and are still there. And I think as a model to roll out to the rest of the world, it would seem pretty obvious that we would need to bring more women to the table in other parts of the world. And perhaps we might not have such strongman politics and such hard politics. So, thank you. Great. Thank you very much. There is somebody behind the bar. You know, luckily.
That's all.
So you're very welcome to stay on, and very welcome to have drinks, and very welcome to continue the discussion. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you, Pat.